Well, everybody, I was really excited to meet and catch up with my guest today at the ASCFG conference last week. Welcome, Lennie, to the Flower Podcast.
Thank you, thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
Well, I know that we've been trying to juggle calendars and schedules, and I was glad to. Yeah, I mean, you spoke at the conference, and God, you were very popular. I thought a lot of
Oh,
people wanted to pick your brain, and with your new book coming out, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like you have a lot to offer, both florists and farmers, and I think this is just a really important topic we're going to talk about today, which is how to help flower farmers become more profitable, which then translates to florists and understanding the needs and them being more profitable. So everyone's going to make more profit today.
yes. Here we are. Here we are. I help everyone make more profit.
So no
Studying
pressure.
God. Here we are. Yeah.
So anyway, always start at the beginning and I want to know, how did you find your way into the world of flowers?
Yeah. It's funny. I never, you tell people to put yourself in the mind of your customer. And I have never bought myself flowers in my life. I mean, now I probably have, but I had never thought I was never interested in flowers. I thought they were like a silly luxury, to tell you the truth. And
Sure.
when I was in high school, my first jobs were on farms in the summer and stuff. I was like a suburban kid in Boston and was just a hippie and like wanted to be outside and worked on farms in the summers when I could. And eventually, like years after college, 10 years after college or whatever, I came around and was like sick of my life in Boston and had moved all over, but was working in social work and adult education. And just one day was like, I'm supposed to be farming, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I applied to the program at UC Santa Cruz because I knew I eventually want to teach farming. So I wanted to get a real good background in it. And that program just it kind of appeared to me, how sometimes you need a lifeline. And I think that's what I needed. And I found that program and I was like, the country's oldest organic agriculture program, that must be what I need to do. Of course, I probably could have just gotten an internship on a farm somewhere, but I moved out to California for that. But still at the time, I was all vegetable focused. Like I did that whole program and then worked there for a year and I was all about vegetable. I couldn't really care less about the flowers. Christoph Bernau is one of the instructors there, and he's well known in the flower community, and he's kind of one of the big flower guys there. And I remember standing with him looking at a harvest board and he of all the flowers that the crew needed to cut for the day. And I was
Right.
like, Christoph, I don't know any of these flowers. And he was like, sure you do. And I was like, okay, sunflowers. Like I just didn't get it. And we started making bouquets. We would make bouquets for the market, for market cart, like twice a week. And I slowly just became interested in doing that. And my friend Zoe Hitchner, who now is the flower manager at Front Porch Farm, which is a really big deal farm in California in Sonoma County, she manages a few acres of cut flowers, and they're like top of the line. They're incredible. But she was my teaching assistant. Like I was kind of one of her students, and then I actually got her job the year when she left. But she would lead us through making bouquets, and I was so clumsy, and I was like, I didn't get it, but I something called to me. And anyways, I later went on to manage a vegetable farm for a few years, but then quickly started expanding the flower production on the vegetable farm. I was like, I think we need to grow a few more flowers. And until the point a few years later where it just became crazy and it was time for me to move on and start my own flower farm. But so it's just funny. It's such a surprise to me that I found flowers, but um, they've honestly done so much for my mental health and kind of grounding me and helping me find focus. And I'm just shocked. It's like something that I never thought would come into my life. And now my whole life revolves around flowers.
That's
There
awesome.
you are. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I'm really glad to hear that. I'm curious, when you were on that farm, that vegetable farm, and you were trying to grow their flower offering, like
Yeah.
what was the conversation like? Was that like a easy sell, or was that kind of like, I don't know, were they skeptical?
Yeah. At first they were fine with it. It was, it was a nonprofit. We were stretched thin. I was, my main job was like hoarding cats, basically, like, well, doing tour after tour after tour and teaching interns and having a small crew and interns and volunteers and all of that. And flowers were always a part of it. But then I started wanting to make nicer bouquets for the farmers market we sold at. And, I reached out to a local florist who ended up being a great customer of mine. And I later worked with him at B-Side, and I later worked with them, kind of as an intern. Like, I learned a lot about wedding production through them, and they became a great friend, Vanda Floral Design, Bryce. So I reached out and said, we'd like to sell you some flowers, basically. And the nonprofit I worked for was fine with it because it was going to bring in a little extra revenue, which as a nonprofit we always we needed. But 2 years later, it became clear that, my vegetable offerings were like sort of diminishing. Like, I didn't have quite as robust of a crop plan with vegetables as I was growing with the flowers. And so we kind of had to come to Jesus moment and said, okay, maybe it's time for me to move on, if this was where my heart was, which it was, it was with the flowers.
So B-Side, was that your family business, like your business? Like,
My business. Yeah. Now it's me and my partner Matt, but it was me. It's funny, it started right around the time when Matt and I got together, which is funny. And he's a chef. He was a chef who was like laid off with COVID, started working with me on the farm, and now it's sort of never looked back. And thank God, because now that I'm doing teaching and writing and research for the bulk of my time, he's sort of taken over my job at the farm. And as we rebuild, because we've just moved to the farm from California to Oregon, as we rebuild our customer base in this new location, it's kind of perfect, because honestly, we're just getting started up here. So right now it's sort of a part-time job for both of us, more for him. And then in a year or two, we'll reevaluate and see how we need to build our team, and also how I'm fitting into the farm, and if we can keep it going with me only like half time on the farm.
sure.
Yeah.
Well, I know that in researching a little bit for our conversation, I knew you had moved. Um, is it okay for me to ask, like, what was the reason for
Yeah,
moving? Because I
totally.
felt like you were in a sweet spot, an expensive sweet spot,
Yeah.
but a sweet spot, and then moving to Oregon.
Yeah,
So
it's sort of a crazy thing to do. It is. I'm not going to say like an idiotic thing to do, but
we'll say it was inspired.
we'll say, yeah, inspired. Yeah, it was like a wild hair. I mean, the simple answer is
Uh-huh.
that we were priced out. And this is something that I don't fully know how to talk about, like on social media and all those things,
Right.
because it's interesting. It's a bunch of different like financial and economic factors, which I always want to talk about more, as you know already. Like, all I talk about is money and flower farming, for the sole reason that I love farming and I want to keep doing it, and I love farmers and I want them to be able to keep farming. And I think they don't often think about money enough, especially if you start in your 20s and you don't know that you need to be like planning for retirement, because that's what everyone else in the corporate world is doing, right?
Right.
Anyways, so we were finally in the position to buy land, basically due to off-farm jobs that I developed over the years. Like, I was able to hire a team from my farm and then sort of replace myself for a couple years while I went and taught and did consulting with this philanthropic farm and all these other things that allowed me to save money. I don't know that by running B-Side itself, I would have been able to save up money to buy my own property, especially not in California. But so we were like finally in this place of like financial stability. I'd never had savings in my life, but then here I was with savings and enough to buy something. But we weren't going to be able to do it in California, or at least in Sonoma County where we
So
were.
were you renting?
We were renting. Sorry, we were renting. Yeah, we
Okay,
were
that
renting.
makes sense. Okay, I
Yeah, yeah,
understand that now.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, and so we were leasing. I've always leased fields, and I've leased like many fields over 10 years or whatever, usually having two different locations, but those locations have changed depending on just land situations. So we were finally in the position to buy land rather. But we realized it wasn't going to make sense there. And so we looked north to Oregon, where I have some family and I went to college here forever ago. And it just made some sense. I know a lot of farmers here, and Matt likes it up here. So we moved up here. Our well also ran dry in California on my annual field. And so we were going to need to move our our
Mm.
field again. And it was like, okay, do we have it in us to move one more time onto a new leased field, or is it time to just bite the bullet, know that it's going to set our business back a few years, but make the move to where we hopefully will be forever. So it was wild. I'm sort of like a wanderer. I've lived everywhere. So in some ways it wasn't that much of a shock for me, but I had built up quite a business, and I was so proud of my business. My farm stand was doing really well. I had grown on less and less land over the years and increased my price point. So I really had built a pretty profitable, tidy business that allowed me to work really manageable hours and employ a few people. And so leaving it behind was, I'm just now realizing what a big deal it was to leave that behind, quite honestly. I wouldn't do it differently, but it's to have spent all those years building up a customer base and like a brand name or whatever, a reputation, and then to leave that behind is it's something I miss right now here in this new market where no one knows us.
Yeah. Well, and it's one of those things I feel like, the time you can never, don't ever put that kind of thing off. I mean, you probably did the exact right thing,
Right.
because it would have only been harder, or whenever you did make that jump, you were going to have to go back that 2 or 3 years to rebuild
Right.
and do that. So why not do it now? Why
Right.
not do it now and
Right.
then grow from there? So your
Yeah.
business in California, um, did you sell everything through a farm stand? I'm just trying to get a feel for kind of like
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
did.
Totally. I've kind of done it all, but I've always been really small, usually growing less than 1 acre. At times I've leased a bit more land than that and had a bit more in production. But I sold primarily to florists and a few like specialty small wholesalers and specialty grocery stores for a number of years. Then I started doing more and more weddings, and for a few years I was really doing, I'd say half of my revenue. I was bringing in like 100 grand a year through weddings, and then maybe another 100 grand through other wholesale enterprises. And then with COVID, of course, like the great pivot, we really beefed up our farm stand, which we already had going, and I had been working to grow it over the years. We changed locations. We started putting more effort into the farm stand. We started doing more retail bouquets delivered down to San Francisco. And so I was able to grow fewer flowers and then mark them up 3 times and sell them at this farm stand, and which was doing like 130 grand a year or something around that, which was like wonderful because it was just such a tidy operation that allowed me to really love what I was doing, because I was able to do things like get a full night's sleep and like have a little bit of a life and really manage my farm rather than having beds upon beds or fields, as is the case with some farms that were out of control, because I used to grow more than I could take care of, quite honestly, but by the end it felt like the perfect size. So yeah, in the end it was really the farm stand, retail bouquets, really small amount of wholesale to florists, and then phasing out of weddings.
I have to admit, and I know I've heard you mention this before, but the you said you did over 100,000 on your farm stand,
Yeah,
and
it was
I'm
something
like,
like 130. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, 130. So I'm like, that is a pretty great farm stand, I would think. And
it was
I
amazing. Yeah.
so were you like in an area that had a lot of foot traffic, or were you main highway, or
Right.
people
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
word of mouth?
Yeah, there's a few factors that led to the success for sure. One is the location, and you wouldn't think it was it was on a busy road that acted as a cutoff from the 101 to the coast. So a lot of people would be coming up from like San Francisco or the Bay Area and then taking this road to cut over to get to some beaches. It was a really fast moving road, though, like a fast moving country road. And so there was tons of traffic, but there was no other reason to stop on this road. And it was actually pretty dangerous. And I was looking for a spot with a lot of traffic to build my farm stand, because my farm was actually like a mile or so away, but I knew I wouldn't have great success if my farm stand was at my farm location. And so I started leasing this space where I built my new farm stand. And I paid $500 a month, which, like, for a lot of people, like, all of these numbers sound crazy. Like 130 grand sounds crazy, but then also like, oh, paying $500 for a farm stand, that sounds crazy too. But then of course those numbers in combination, you see why it all makes sense, or why I was
Right,
willing to
right.
pay rent. But so built it on this busy road, but just because it was on the busy road didn't mean it was going to succeed. I actually had to grow sales over the, like, I think we were there for 3 years, and we had a farm stand at a previous location for another 2, and a lot of the traffic followed me. So I did a lot of
Wow.
things to make it that successful. First of all, I did a lot of marketing finally. So I like put out ads in magazines, like things that I wouldn't have done for other parts of my business. Ads in magazines, some online marketing. I invested in a lot of really awesome road signs with really specific cues to get people to slow down. Like I used to drive the route over and over and be like, okay, with that curve, if we put a sign just before it that says slow before the curve, and then the next sign has to say it's going to be on your left. Like it sounds silly, but over the years we had more signs made, better signs made, using really specific language with the right size font that got people to slow down and stop, because the goal was to, like, I would always meet customers who were like, I've driven by 20 times and I finally stopped. And I'm like, okay, how can I get them to stop the first time or the second time? And then I also had like an email newsletter sign up, or I
Mhm.
had a checkout sheet rather, where they could sign up for the email, but I was asking them, I was tracking what they bought. I was asking them if they had been there before. So I was able to really closely kind of segment my customers and see how they found me, and then take action according to the results, So like, and usually it was about 50% people who knew of me, knew of my flowers, and 50% people who found me because they were driving by. And then I also was, last thing, sorry, I could talk all day about this,
You're
obviously, but
fine.
the last thing was that I was really, really careful with the prices. So I was pretty expensive. My bouquet is my standard bouquet was like $35, which doesn't sound crazy, but it was fairly small. So I think if people were going to spend that, they typically would expect something bigger, but I was marking things three times. I'm marking things up 3 times from my wholesale to florist price. And if I bought in flowers, which I did sometimes from other farms, I would mark them up 3 times. And I would be really careful not to offer anything cheaper than that. Like sometimes a $25 mason jar or something, but I knew if I had $10 bunches of flowers, people would buy them, but they would buy them at the expense of the $35 bouquet, and they often wouldn't buy 3 or 4 of them. So like most people came and just wanted to buy something. So I like pushed them up into that $35 price level, which sounds a little sinister, but that's what it is, and I did all this testing. And then the other thing that I did was make sure that I had more expensive bouquets there to make the $35 bouquet seem cheaper, which is like classic, rule of sales, I think. But yeah, all these things in combination allowed the farm stand to do really well and keep growing in sales over the year. And I made it really cute and all that. So yeah, it was wonderful. And it's certainly like not something that every person can create, because it is location dependent. However, I know a ton of people who are out in the middle of nowhere who have built a great following for their farm stand. So I think there's hope, and there's way to be really pragmatic about it.
Well, and I think too, I know it's interesting because I had the opportunity to have a lot of conversations last week at the conference, and just talking about how different people market different things. And I think that if you're growing a variety of things, and especially if they are value valuable items, they're not all fillers or green, I mean, you're
Right.
growing, we'll talk design, like a face flower, focal
Yeah.
flower,
Yeah.
you're growing um uh, uh, the money shot flower, the flower
Right.
that people
Right.
are, oh, I want this to go post on Instagram or
Right.
something like that, because
Yeah.
it's a thing. So
Yeah.
um I get it, and I can appreciate the fact that you had more expensive bouquets to give perspective on the pricing.
Right.
I
And the
think
50
that's
but the $50 bouquets often wouldn't sell, but there were just a few of them, and they were there to make the 35 look cheaper.
yeah, yeah. So no, I love that. Now, um, there's so many things we could talk about.
I know.
I'm blown away by that, but I'm also encouraged by that. I feel like a lot of times, one of the big things I mean, farmers don't always. I run into this with florists. I'm gonna back up. We run into this with florists a lot that don't know how to charge for their wedding flowers, and we've had a lot of conversations on the podcast about that. About making sure the markup, making sure you're charging for your labor, making sure you're charging for all these things, and we haven't had as many conversations about this on the farmer side,
Yeah.
and I think it's just as important. And it's kind of the same scenario, just like with florists, that a lot of times people get into this industry or get into this kind of a business because they have a love of connecting with nature, or they love flowers, or they just love getting their hands dirty, and it's a therapeutic, like you mentioned earlier. It's like it's everything. It's a
Yeah.
thing. It's a big
Yeah.
thing. And but when it's all said and done, you don't want to pick your head up 3 years later or 4 years later and wonder, you know, am I making money? Because
Right.
that's a hard conversation to have at that point, because you've already
Yeah.
made a lot of decisions, some of which might have not been the best decisions.
Right.
They might have been more, and I'm a big heart person, so it's hard for me because that's just me.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are heart decisions and not business, brain decisions.
Right.
And we I don't know how you feel, but sometimes I just feel like we work really hard.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's really sad that at the end of the day, we don't even know if we've made money.
It's really sad. It's really sad. And I think there's a lot at stake. Like, I remember when I was first explaining, actually, when you were talking, something flashed into my mind, which was a conversation I had with some family back east when I was visiting, which was 2 years ago, when I was headed up to Vermont to have a meeting with Chelsea Green to propose my book. And they were like, and I was getting my like elevator pitch ready sort of for the book and why it was necessary. And so my family was like, well, what's the problem? Like, what's the big problem you're trying to, everyone takes a while to figure out their business. So what's the problem that you're trying to explain? And I was like, well, to boil it down in a nutshell, it's that, yeah, there's this, I think, a critical time of like your first 5 years farming where most of us are not figuring it out. We're getting better at farming, we're getting better at selling, but we're
Right.
just trying out random stuff. We have no strategy, no sense of our cost, absolutely no sense of where our time is going, like what we're spending our precious time on, what crops or what like activities on the farm, where we're wasting time, where the waste is. And
Right.
there's a lot at stake because we're burning out in the process. It's not like, I don't know, I don't want to compare it to some other industry, but it's blood, sweat, and tears. Like, I look back now and like all the things that happened to me my first number of years farming, from like your body breaking down, you're like just all these things that you're burning out, and you're losing this like, you're losing, I think, mental capacity, you're losing physical capacity, you're probably
Absolutely.
spending some of your savings. And so therefore farms are just going out of business, and then there's new farms entering the market, which is like fine, but then they're going through the same thing. They're kind of, and meanwhile, all this turnover is kind of upsetting the supply chain. It's like, just when we're trying to make our mark as local farmers and like, move forward with the local flower movement, it's a bunch of new farms entering the industry and other ones leaving all the time. So how can we really gain any footing? And how can wholesalers and florists learn how to work with us if it's always new farms? So there's a lot at stake. And yeah, I just like you, it's sad. And I just want farmers to be able to get their stuff together a little bit earlier, learn these business skills in order to build viable, profitable, thriving businesses.
Well, if this topic interests you today, we're gonna keep talking about it. But I do want to. I don't want to wait till necessarily the end, but I do want to let you guys know you can pre-order Lennie's book now on pretty much everywhere. But we're gonna put links on her page on our website and in the show notes to that, so that way you can go ahead and pre-order your book. I am excited to say that I have seen a little preview of the book, and I told her, I said, it's really one of the most beautiful business books I think I've ever seen. There's a lot of great content in there. And I kind of wanted to see, I don't know, maybe we can do this. I know it's so funny. I'm guilty of this. I mean, today I bought some plants already, and this is the thing. So everyone's looking at seeds, they're looking for, placing their plug orders, placing their perennial. They're all planning next year. And I'm like, what a great time to try to plan out, am I going to make any money? Is this a heart flower or a bottom line flower?
Right.
And I feel like this is a really critical time for that, for every flower farmer. And how I know it's like there's some things that are so obvious, like, okay, well, we know how much the seed plants or plugs cost. We know we know that I got to pay a mortgage. We know that we have to pay a water bill. We know there's some expenses, but how do we really, especially if it's a flower we've never grown, can you even estimate kind of what that might cost you, to know if that's a good choice, or do you have to take the plunge and then try to calculate the numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny because in other industries, I imagine that the biggest problem is that expenses get away from you. You're spending way too much money. And sure, on flower farms, some people can be more careful with how much money they're spending, but really the big problem is our labor. It's just that we only have a set number of hours we can work in the week. Same with, those of us who have employees, we only have their hours, and you realize how precious time is when you're paying employees salaries, right?
Yeah.
And so the biggest problem is that we are spending all this time on all these crops that probably aren't making us money. So like labor is the big problem. It's the elephant in the room. It's the challenge. And so yeah, I think I have a few things in my head of like ways to answer that question. And one is that if you're still building up your farm and building up your market, I don't think you need to be growing the most expensive crops to grow. You don't need to be growing. I'm not to throw like cloney Hanoi ranunculus under the bus, but you probably don't need to be growing that unless you have a market who is clamoring for that, and you know that they're going to pay uh I don't know, $6 a stem, whereas you might only charge $2 a stem for a regular Italian ranunculus, just or whatever the numbers are, probably you're going to be able to grow ranunculus like labelle ranunculus or Italian ranunculus, and that's going to be just good enough. Maybe you don't even need to grow ranunculus if you're brand new. But so basically, you can supply certainly florists and wholesalers and local retail markets with flowers that have cheaper upfront costs. But once you have a little bit of experience, I think the thing to do is, first of all, just start simplifying. Like I work with, I coach a lot of farmers and I teach a lot of farmers in courses, and most of them are growing way too many crops. They're really small farms. They're pretty new to flower farming business, like 2, 3, 4 years. And they're growing every crop under the sun. So I think the first thing to do is really simplify. And I'm going to say, like, cut out a third of the crops you're growing. And before you have the cost of production information, which most of us don't have, because it takes a while to go through that process, and we can talk about that. But lean into the crops that are doing well for you, that there's demand for, that you can grow well, that you don't experience much waste with, and grow more of those, and cut out the crops where you're spending a lot of time, where there's a lot of upfront cost and there's not a lot of demand. So that's like a simple way to look at it. But yeah, I mean, simplify. Like farmers who come back to me and tell me that they've actually slashed items from their crop list, like up to like a third of the crops they're growing, I'm like, you'll never look back. Yes, you might introduce more crops again one day, but there's this idea that we need to diversify, and to some extent, sure, but not to the point that people are doing. And I grew, like we talked about my farm stand, my bouquets were beautiful. Like I'm not like high and mighty about everything I do, but my bouquets were really beautiful, and I only grew like 15 crops, and I had a really diverse looking farm stand, and my customers were satisfied. So these new farmers who are selling retail, who might think that they need to have a huge variety, they don't. There was one other thing I was going to say, which escaped me, but yeah, it's we need to be growing fewer crops because we need to be becoming experts in the crops that we do grow. And we need to be cutting out the crops that are losing us money.
Yeah, I can see that too, because I feel like sometimes, and I think you kind of touched on this about, what does your market need? Because you have to sometimes look at what's going on around you. And if somebody is, like if you know that, gosh, everywhere I go, there's zinnias. So maybe that's not the crop for me. Or maybe everywhere I go, there's dahlias, especially in Santa Cruz. I can imagine there's a few.
Right. Right.
And, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't grow them. But it just means that you have to find maybe your niche. And if your niche is a farm stand, or a market stand, then you may be able to grow all kinds of things then. But if your niche is florists or selling to wholesalers or grocery stores, paring down your offerings, because you're going to need more of those you may need
Yeah.
more, you're going to need a lot more bells or a lot more lilies or a lot more whatever it is you put in your bouquet, because
Right.
your grocery store account is going to want 50 of these every single week, or something like that. And so you have to kind of watch those things. But I don't know. I'm really glad you said what you said about Clooney, because if you are on the gram and you see all these incredible flowers, it makes you sometimes have FOMO and
Right.
you want to grow them. Well, you really need to have the market for them, because
Right.
they are not cheap. And if you can't sell them for the same thing you sell a less expensive, ordinary ranunculus. Not that there's ordinary ones, but there are some that are less expensive. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
and I sometimes cringe when people come to me about anemones or ranunculus, because I feel like the market is so flooded with that product at the time of year. But if you have your own following, if you're going to put the money into the marketing, then maybe that's a niche you can grow into if you really want to grow them.
Right.
But I feel like there's so many other flowers out there that, I know I was watching today, Farmer Bailey. Bailey was doing his recap that they did at the conference,
Yeah.
showing all the new things they're going to be offering. And
Oh,
I'm like,
awesome.
yeah, this is the kind of material that people need to really look at, because it's funny. Like, he had snowberry as something that may be a fall of 2024 thing. I think maybe spring. I don't know, but and I think, yes, I'm so excited to see some of these other flowers out there, because number one, yeah, they're maybe a little bit expensive and they may require some time, but you can get money for them.
Yeah.
They're a high value item, and the florists know them, the wedding professionals know them, like snowberry, but the average consumer never gets to see this flower.
Right.
And if
Yeah.
you're making bouquets or whatever, anyway, I know I'm going down a rabbit trail, but I just
No.
feel like really understanding your market, and visit your local wholesaler, visit some flower shops. You don't have to tell them you're a flower farmer.
Right. Right.
You don't have to do that. You can just walk in as a customer and see, what
Yeah.
are they selling? How are they using it? What colors are they looking for? I mean,
Right.
I feel like that kind of information is really important and
Yeah.
can be an eye opener that can maybe save some heartache and create some profit. But
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think social media, I mean, I think it's doing us a huge disservice. And I think it's almost, I mean, dangerous sounds like a strong word, but
it's
all
on
these
the
new,
edge.
yeah, yeah, all these new flower farmers, like you see other people posting, let's say it is the big expensive ranunculus. So you assume that that means that's what you're supposed to grow. And
Right.
that makes the, new flower farmer sound dumb or something. No, it's just like this is what they see, so this is what they think is happening. But no, someone is posting that flower because maybe they have high demand for it, but because it's photogenic, because it's like hip and trending, but we know nothing about the context behind that post or that photo, or if that grower is able to sell bunch after bunch after bunch of ranunculus at a good
Right.
price point, or if it's just one random thing that they sold once. And so we all kind of start off growing the same things, and yeah, it's silly, and it's not like every flower farmer needs to end up with a really specialty crop that they grow, but it's worth investigating what is going to lead to continued high sales for you. I mean, I planted at one point when I was sick of growing the same thing that everyone else was growing. I leased a new field, a half-acre field, and spent a year cover cropping it and planted 3,000 peonies, which like doesn't sound novel because everyone's planting peonies, but no one was growing them in my area because we were just on the border of a zone that was too warm to grow them. So I was like, I'm going to be the local peony grower. And I went all in on it because I was like, I want to have something different. And I want to have, if I'm going to continue to sell wholesale, I want to have like one big crop that I know I can supply 100 bunches of or whatever it is. And then continue to have a more diversified crop plan of crops I grew in smaller amounts for my bouquet program. Yeah.
Wow, that's an investment. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
especially if you're spending time cover cropping and then you can't cut them the first year or the second year.
Totally.
And,
Yeah.
but man, I bet you were the belle of the ball when they started blooming.
It was
So,
awesome. Yeah, it was wonderful. And I like sadly, we moved, and what ended up happening is that we had like a dig situation. So people came and dug peonies. I sold them that way. So we, had to kind of take the field apart after a number of years when we moved, but it went great. There were some other cultural issues. Like I think we do get more disease on them, botrytis and other things due to the lack of chill hours, which I just needed to figure out. And if I had more time, I would have continued to fine tune the varieties that I was going to cull out and then invest more in, and the spraying practices and all that. But yeah, it was great. And I think farmers can choose a few crops to grow at a bigger scale. And then if they're still interested in a diverse crop plan, they can grow smaller amounts of a lot of other stuff. And like you said, like that first florist that I started working with and I started working for, I would snoop around the shop, not snoop around, I would look around the shop and notice what he was buying in every single week, and things like Dusty Miller, or now like raspberry foliage might be a good example, like something that they can use every single week. You don't need to change it up. You don't need to bring them the most fancy face flower. You just need to be providing flowers that you can grow, keep your costs down, sell at a good price, and sell over and over and over and over.
so I'm bursting with questions. So briefly, I'm curious, like when you take a crop like peonies, going back to that for a minute, um, how do you cost that out? Because there's a lot of inputs and you don't get any return till, like I said, maybe year three.
Right.
So how do you calculate a cost on a flower like that? Because, this year I've been trying to promote more woodies and more perennials and things like that. And sometimes that's a multi-year investment. It's a
Yeah.
great investment. You'll get your money, but how do you cost that out to know what
Yeah.
to charge for it?
Right, totally. It's tricky and it's funny. I wish I had a better answer, but right now I'm deep into all this grant funded research where I'm like the project manager for all these grants, where I'm working with 11 different farmers across the country to help them track the cost of production on a few crops. But we're focused on annuals right now. And I hope to like lean more into perennials in the future and woodies, but basically you would just need to sort of depreciate it over. So, those, the labor over the years, much like you would in accounting. So I think the goal then with a crop like that there's this big upfront investment that you're not going to be able to pay back for a few years. The goal is to really make sure your labor in those first few years can be minimal. I think so. Like weed management on those crops as they're growing in is going to be key. But yeah, the process of figuring out the cost of production is a little trickier.
Sure.
However, for most farms, once they lean into that, they find them to be more profitable for sure.
Right, right. In the long term, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Especially because a lot of them, maybe you get 3 stems the first year, but then you get 10 stems the second year, and then you may get
Right.
20 stems the third year. I
Yeah.
mean, it's definitely an exponential situation there. Well, how do you? Okay, so let's talk about what you just hinted at, because
Yeah, yeah,
um, in doing this book, and I know that when we, I think one of the people that you've been working with is Shanti, that
yeah. Whipstone.
which
Yeah,
yeah, Whipstone, that we had on the podcast a few weeks ago,
yeah.
and I know she was telling me about some of it, and so tell me. Let's find out about the research. How are you getting some of the information you're getting, and how what is the motivation behind it, and what is your goal in doing this research?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I started embarking on this kind of research path at the same time that I was proposing the book. So I think it was 2 years ago. And I hope to have a lot more data by now to share in the book. And I don't necessarily have all the data that I want, but we're getting there. And I think the process is like the most important thing. And I do share
Sure.
that in the book. But so I set out asking two main questions. One is, how can we start to learn about the cost of production of some flower crops? How can we, gather some information, but also find and use and share a process that works for flower farmers to get in touch with their cost of production? And then also, how can we look at larger benchmarks in our industry, and what are typical gross sales per acre? What's a typical net profit per acre? What are the labor hours? So these are the kind of two parts of my studies
Mm.
recently. So it's kind of like the macro, and then the other I don't know if it's micro, but the specific. um and so I applied for these grants through Western SARE, and now I'm doing a bigger grant through them, which is like a real, a real research grant. I think it's like a 75 grand grant, and the next one that I just applied for is 100 grand. And the farmers who work with me in the study do get paid for their research, which is awesome, and which it's important to me. So everyone involved is like getting paid for their time. But basically, we are using a program called Know Your Cost to Grow, which was developed by Oregon State University Center for Small Farms in collaboration with Oregon Tilth and a woman named Tanya Murray. And there's actually an awesome article about it in Growing for Market that just came out. But so I looked around at these different methods of doing enterprise budgets, and I honed in on this one because it seemed to me to solve a few problems that were still outstanding in other methods of doing this kind of research. So basically, like making it a little easier for the farmers to do it, and also getting more detail about this labor piece, which is the big problem. So it's a specific system of tracking your specific crop costs for each crop. And it's I share kind of a simplified method in the book. And it's multi-step, and it's about doing time studies, and it's about just really trying to track what you're doing on the farm and where your labor is going. But it's really been thrilling to work with these farms and to help these farmers slow down and pay attention to what they're doing on the farm, and to describe their system. Okay, what's your system for growing ranunculus? Like, and you have to list out all your steps, and then the time studies come, and then the calculations come later. But just being able to say, this is how we grow ranunculus, these are our steps for the bed prep, we weed the crop this many times, we do this kind of spraying this many times, of course knowing that there are differences that happen every year. But I think it's important for small new flower farmers to start thinking this way, because most of us don't have systems where we like weed when it seems time to weed, which is usually too late, or when we have time. And so going through this process, I think, is helping farmers not only get in touch with their costs, but also develop real streamlined systems for their farm, and get buy-in from their employees on how to become more efficient as a team, and how the manager, the farm owner, can better manage and put better practices in place to allow the employees to work faster and more efficiently. And I think that creates an overall like happier workplace too. So it's, in this world of, in the face of capitalism, it's like, how can we compassionately build businesses that don't exploit labor. You know what I mean? So that comes into it too. It's like, how can we do better in this world of really small margins, from this lens of how can we help the whole team do better to lead to a more profitable farm, which is hopefully, the benefits are hopefully shared among the team, if that makes sense. Like, because it's a problem. It's like, how do we work faster? How do we get more out of each employee? How do we get more out of each hour? That's not the right approach, but that is the challenge. And so I think practices like these and research like this helps people dive into their process and see how they can do better, what works and what won't work. That was sort of a tangent, but all these things come into play for me when I think about it.
Well, I know, and I I appreciate what you had to say there, especially that last part, because it's this is a very complex issue, and everybody wants a simplified answer, and there's too many variables to give that. How much does your land cost isn't what my land costs.
Right.
How much your labor is in your market versus my labor in my market. Um, Property taxes you might pay in Oregon versus me here in Tennessee might be
Right.
I mean, there's so many different facets to it, and it has to all work, right?
Yeah.
And I can say that I do believe that somehow if you're able to build your team of employees and help them, and I love what you said when you were talking about the research and helping them become part of the education might also help them become aware of, listen, if we don't make these goals, these projection goals, then we have to charge more for product, which might mean we sell less product, which might mean
Right.
I can't afford X, Y, and Z anymore.
Totally.
So it's all connected. It's all it's not we can't be obtuse about it, and we just
Right.
really have to push through. But I'm really glad that you're doing this research. I have to say that um, we need people out there speaking this language and
Yeah.
speaking, helping us understand and demystifying it and simplifying it. I know when your book comes out, it's from. I know I've seen several charts in it, and I really liked like some of the sections. I think I told you before we started recording about, helping people understand that it's okay to have different price levels for selling to a wholesaler, selling to a florist wholesale, selling to, if you're doing weddings,
Right.
being
Yeah.
familiar with all these different markups, because it's opportunity for you to not leave money on the table, and to diversify your product offerings and your income stream. And if those are things you want, I mean,
Right.
obviously it has to work for you. Not
Right.
everyone wants to do weddings, but not everybody wants to do farmers markets. So I mean, it's
Right.
the two extremes.
Yeah.
But anyway, so with your book, um, I feel, it's so funny you said this, and I'm gonna express my ignorance here. Just is enterprise budgets? What is that? I've heard this term now twice,
Yeah.
and I'm curious: is that like a specific kind of budget, or
Yeah. Good
for those
question.
of us who don't know that term?
No, no worries. It's another way of saying, like, the figuring out how much it costs you to grow a crop. So it's a cost of production for one specific crop.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's enterprise. So it could be also like, another business producing a different commodity, or with a different service. It's like drilling down into that specific enterprise. And in this case, it's a crop.
I
So I
understand.
also talk about that a lot with our different sales channels. So just like we need to evaluate the crops we're growing and see which ones are making us money and simplify. Same thing with our sales channels. I mean, this is a rant that I think I think anyone I meet, this is probably like what I say. It's probably old. What I'm trying to say is that I probably sound like a broken record, but we need to be being more careful about where we're selling and who we're selling to, and try to do a better job selling to the customers that we do sell to, and selling and really specializing in one or two types of customers, one or two sales channels, doing a better job there, selling more there at the expense of like spreading ourselves really thin and trying to sell through every level of farmers markets, farm stand, DIY weddings, full service weddings, wholesalers, grocery. Like no one's going to do a good job if they're selling through all those different channels unless they've been around for a very long time and have developed the systems and the team to support that. But most of us small farms, less than a couple acres, less than 5 acres, should have a more streamlined, simplified, you know, list of customer levels that we're selling through. So you could also do an enterprise analysis where you're looking at the costs to sell through that channel, which can be as simple as starting to track your time getting ready for farmers market and then spending the whole day at farmers market, which is a lot of labor, you know, a lot of time. And if
Right.
you're not like ringing in the sales, then it's questionable whether or not it's making you money.
Well, and I'm glad you said that, because every one of those channels, once you get it out of the field, there's all that labor, has its own labor levels to them,
Yeah.
in addition to everything you've already done. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's another crazy thing to have to think about. Okay, so tell us more, if you don't mind. I'd like to hear more about the book. What is the full title? Because I'm it's a lot. I can't remember now.
Oh, please. Yes, no worries. It's the Flower Farming for Profit, which is now the name of my new business and the new website. But Flower Farming for Profit, the complete guide to growing a cut flower business. So the idea is that it's everything other than growing the actual crops. So it's, you know, there's 3 sections. The first is becoming a flower farmer. So that's like the ins and outs of sales channels, like things they don't tell you about selling at farmers markets. Like not everyone needs to start there. You know, researching your market, a deep dive on floral design and weddings and like really specific pricing for weddings. And then the second part is planning for profitability. So it's crop planning through a really specific lens of what is needed in your market. And actually, we can mention this at the end too, but I have a guide for your listeners about it's a great table that I have in the book, but I wanted to make it available to people, that lists out a bunch of different common cut flower crops and then helps you learn how to evaluate them through the lens of their marketplace demand and how they work for you. So that's just something cool that we can share with your listeners. But yeah, there's a whole part on crop planning, pricing, bookkeeping, leases, and then the third section of the book is employee management, record keeping, marketing, a deep dive on email marketing and strategies for growth, and knowing if it's time to scale or if it's time to just do better what you're doing and stay the same size. Because I think a lot of farms look to scale up, but they end up not really doing better at the end of the day. They end up just working more and only making a few more dollars. And so it's not always worth it to try to get bigger. So that's like a broad overview of the book. And it was 2 years of writing. There's lots of case studies. Steve and Mandy, your friends, you know, my friends, our mutual wonderful friends, Bluma Farm, Mima and Miranda are featured in there. So a bunch of farmers who are doing really cool things and have really interesting kind of business related stories to tell. And a lot of my mentors too, because like I would be nothing without the ASCFG and without all the people who have mentored me over the years, which is why the conference was so wonderful. And it was great to see you there. But, Judy Lashman is retiring after 35 years. And we have this whole ceremony for her. I was bawling through the whole thing. And like,
that was so incredible.
It was incredible.
It was,
yeah.
It was the stories. Wonderful. It was so funny to see, the stories and the games they played about trying to guess whose quote they were or whatever. And of course, Judy loves to be in the limelight. So not really. And so watching her kind of squirm through this whole thing which was also part of the comedic tension of it, and of course her family being there got surprised anyway. So that was really special.
This thing happened where I became so emotional because of that, and because I just love Judy and I consider her a close friend. I really love her, and she's done such a wonderful job with the organization. So it was this place of like appreciating that and looking around the room at all these different generations of farmers who were there. And then, by like 11 o'clock at night, a bunch of us would end up in Farmer Bailey and Thomas's room, having cocktails and reminiscing. it just became this big love fest of, and would look around the room of these people who were sort of like in my cohort, although there were different ages and different experience levels in there. And I was like, oh, these are the people I'm going to know for the rest of my life. You know what I mean?
Mm.
These are the people I came up with, and we've learned so much from each other. And something just clicked where it's like, oh, this isn't just one of my communities. Like, this is my family. These
Yeah.
people, you know, it was really wild. I was like crying all weekend, and I don't cry. So it was special. Yeah, it was a really special time.
Well, I agree. It is a very special organization. The people that are involved in it care about the organization and all of its members so deeply.
Yeah.
And I feel like so many times what we do is very isolating, and it's, we're not around, or you know, other people in our life don't get it, don't know why we work so hard to do what we do, or don't understand the passion that we might have for it. But
Right.
then when you get around these people at the conference, you're like, okay, they get it. They know, they feel the same way. It's like,
Yeah.
it's like they hear me, they see me, and it doesn't surprise me that you felt that way, because I really it's special. It's a very special thing.
Yeah.
And I know I walked away from it realizing what we do is more important now than ever. And it's for a lot of reasons. But that's one reason why I wanted to have you as a guest so um, fervently, because I want this wave of flower farmers, the businesses that are out there, to become sustainable, financially. I
Yeah.
don't think that with everything that we do, we need to make sure we're putting, and I'm saying this for the florists listening too, that we need to make sure that these people, for all their blood, sweat, and tears, are compensated for their time, their energy, their livelihood. Because I can promise you, that's it's a lot of personal investment, at the expense of a lot of levels, into
Yeah.
these things. And that's before you even know you have a real
Right.
business.
Right. Yeah.
And so I really appreciate what you do, and I appreciate, I know you're doing coaching, which I think is incredible. I know you're doing all kinds of things through, the flower farming for profit, that whole situation. And I want more people to know about you, and to understand what you do is really, really important. And I'm excited to hear. And I also, I kind of, the research part of what you're involved in is so critical. Um, I know I hate the fact that some of the research doesn't make it to the book yet, but I will say that I'm grateful that I understand the importance of doing research correctly,
Right.
because if you rush it and you don't get the real, especially such a complicated issue or
Right.
topics like this, the research will be meaningless. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I appreciate that investment. It's kind of like planting those peonies. You gotta
Right. Right.
you gotta put the time in to get the
Totally.
return. And so I'm grateful for you doing that. So
I
thank you.
appreciate that. Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And yeah, you know, and it turns out that the book is like a little less of a textbook than it started out in my mind. But what my editors have all told me is that it's a much better book now. It's much more accessible. So you're spared like all of the graphs and the charts that I wanted to include it. But that's why I scurried over the past few months to build my website out. And so now finally that website is live. And if you click on the resources tab, there's a place where I share all my grant results. So it'll show, you know, an example from one farm about their cost, a pie chart of their cost of production for Lysianthus and what their results were. And I'm trying to upload all of that nerdy stuff on the website so that people who are interested can find it, but then also just lots of other free resources and guides and stuff. And then I'm I'm calling it the Business Academy, the Flower Farming for Profit Academy. So it's an online course that goes deeper into these topics than I could go in the book even, and that'll launch in January.
Oh,
So
that's
this is a
exciting.
way. Yeah, I'm thrilled about it. I taught a smaller version of it live on Zoom last year, and this is greatly expanded. So it's sort of like a deep dive into the setting up the business behind your farm, and it's probably best for people who have been farming from like anywhere to from two to I'll say like 6 years, something like that. Although there's outliers on both sides that it can help, but people who are farming and know how to grow some crops but want to do better with their business. And I also do this group coaching thing where I have these groups that meet every month. And so we're launching new groups in January. And so people can find out about that on my website too. But I want to have lots of free resources available too. And I'm trying to share lots of stuff through my new Instagram. And I think the ASCFG is also doing an amazing job lately at creating more resources surrounding business topics, which is just so important. So there's there's some really great resources within our industry and within our organization. And I encourage everyone to go digging for those because they're great. But yeah, thank you for saying that. And thank you for what you do too. Like I love your podcast, and I love you ask the best questions on all your interviews, and you really get at the heart of people's operations. And I love listening. So I'm
Thank
glad to be
you.
here.
You're so sweet. Well, I always have to end with my advice question. And I can't wait to ask you because of everything you're working on.
Yeah.
What one piece of advice would you like to leave our listeners?
Yeah, I think like based on what we've been talking about, it's about you need to strategize and simplify. Don't just try things out randomly in your business. Make a plan, see what works and what doesn't work, see where your time goes, and focus on doing fewer things but doing them better. And that's all kind of broad, but it's because it can apply to everything you do. Um,
Absolutely.
do less but do it better, and you will do better too. So
Right. You can make more money by improving the process.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I
Yeah,
love that. I love that 1,000%. Well, Lennie, thank you so much for being on the Flower Podcast.
thank you. So much fun. Thank you for having me.